Hello all, welcome to this IB Biology video tutorial. Today we're looking at gas exchange, which relates to 6.4 in your textbook or PDF chapters. First of all, a little about what gas exchange is and why it's so important. Gas exchange is where oxygen enters the body and CO2 or carbon dioxide leaves the body. This occurs in the lungs, or more specifically in the alveoli of the lungs. We've seen respiration before, in this case aerobic respiration, which is basically glucose from our food and oxygen reacting in the mitochondria to produce carbon dioxide, water, and also energy in the form of ATP. This all occurs in the mitochondria in our eukaryotic cells, this membranous structure with the internal matrix. And we'll look at a lot more about this in the aerobic respiration section soon. But what we really want to focus on here today is the oxygen coming in and the CO2 coming out. Oxygen is a reactant in aerobic respiration, the chemical reaction in the mitochondria of cells which provides energy in the form of ATP from the breakdown of glucose. And carbon dioxide is a waste product of this same reaction. It needs to be removed from the body. Okay, our first understanding is that air is carried into the lungs in the trachea and bronchi, and then to the alveoli in bronchioles. So we're looking at those four parts of the lungs, and you need to understand the structure of the respiratory system. Here's a picture directly from your book, so let's talk this through. You need to know this quite well. You may need to be able to draw it, and there may be multiple choice or short answer questions about this structure. Air enters the respiratory system via the nose or the mouth through a tube called the pharynx. It then passes through the larynx, which contains the voice box and also vocal cords. It moves down through the trachea into the lungs themselves. It moves to each lung through one of two bronchi, one to the left lung, one to the right lung. And these branch continually, getting smaller and smaller into smaller tubes called the bronchioles. And these in turn end in alveoli, which are small sacs where the gas exchange actually takes place. And we'll have a look at these in more detail in just a moment. Okay, our next understanding is that ventilation, we'll look at a definition of that in a moment, maintains concentration gradients of oxygen and carbon dioxide between air in the alveoli and blood flowing in adjacent capillaries. Now we'll spend a little bit more time talking about this understanding later, but let's firstly have a look at what ventilation is. The theory behind this is that all cells in our body need a constant supply of oxygen and the constant removal of CO2. This is achieved by our circulatory system working with our respiratory system. So this is 6.2 and 6.4 of our textbook working together. We're looking here at the heart and blood vessels and also the lungs. Ventilation is the process where air moves in and out of the lungs in two stages. Firstly, inspiration, and secondly, expiration. This is also known as breathing. This is controlled by muscles. We're going to look at muscles of the diaphragm, the abdomen, the intercostal or between ribs muscles, and also the action of the rib cage, the bones of the rib cage. The lungs themselves are passive. They don't contain any sort of muscles and they can't produce any sort of purposeful movement on their own. But we're going to see they are influenced by the structures around them. Okay, so our next understanding is that muscle contractions cause pressure changes inside the thorax that force air in and out of the lungs to ventilate them. Quite a complex understanding, but hopefully you'll understand it a little bit better after this section. As we've seen, ventilation is breathing. Now this process is dependent on the inverse relationship between pressure and volume. Here's a nice little diagram to help us demonstrate this process. Inspiration involves the increase in the volume of the lungs. As the volume increases, the pressure inside the lung decreases. So this is why we call it an inverse relationship. As one goes up, the other goes down. As the pressure goes down inside the lungs, air moves into the lungs from the high pressure environment outside to the low pressure environment inside. So air is drawn in as we breathe in. During expiration or breathing out, a decrease in the volume of lungs leads to an increase in the pressure inside the lungs. The air therefore moves out of the lungs from the relatively high pressure inside to the relatively low pressure outside. So we always see this relationship between volume and pressure, and we always see the movement of air from high pressure region to low pressure region. So let's have a look at how these changes in volume and therefore pressure take place. Okay, the human body is made up of various cavities or spaces. You can see down the bottom there in pink the abdominal cavity, which we'll look at fairly soon. That's 6.1. But what we're looking at today is a thoracic cavity. It's a thoracic cavity. You can see there. So this is the area that has the heart and also the lungs. Lungs are located in the thoracic cavity, also known as the thorax. And this is the way it's referred to in the understanding above, the thorax. This area is completely closed off or sealed from the outside environment, the outside air. There is only one opening into the thorax, which is through the trachea via the nose and the mouth. So this is the only connection between the outside environment all around us and the inside environment of our lungs, through the nose and through the mouth. Now, the basic principle is this. If the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, so does the volume of the lungs. So if the thoracic cavity increases, the volume of the lungs increases also. And the opposite is true. If the volume or the area inside the thoracic cavity decreases, the volume of the lungs decrease also. So let's have a look at what is influencing those changes in volume and also, as we've seen, pressure. And this is related to the muscles and the bones of the thorax, and these are responsible for changing the thoracic volume. Okay, so this is taken from your book, a nice simple diagram here. This is inspiration. So this is the process where air is breathed into the lungs. A number of steps are involved here. First of all, the diaphragm contracts down. So the diaphragm is the muscle located at the bottom there in the brown, and when it contracts, it pulls down. The intercostal, or the muscles between the ribs, and also a particular set of abdominal muscles also contract to push the rib cage up. So this combination of the diaphragm pulling down and the rib cage pulling up increases, the muscles there raise the rib cage, and we see the volume of the thorax and therefore the lungs increase. So the action of all of these muscles increases the volume of the thorax, and therefore it increases the volume of the lungs. Now, if the volume of the lungs increases, the lung pressure decreases. And now we have relatively high pressure outside, relatively low pressure inside the lungs, so when the mouth is open, air rushes in to fill that space through the nose or the mouth. And this is the process that leads to inhalation or breathing in. Now you need to really understand this process and understand the steps involved. Look at the relation between the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles, and also those muscles in the abdomen. Now let's look at the opposite. So this is expiration now. So this is where air is being moved out of the lungs, also known as breathing out. So in this case, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles relax. Relax is misspelt there, I'm sorry. And another set of abdominal muscles contract. And what this does is it basically allows the weight of the ribs to press down on the lungs, the bones of the ribs, and this leads to a decrease in the volume of the lungs. So the volume of the thorax and therefore the lungs decreases, and as you can imagine, as it decreases, the lung pressure increases. So now you have high pressure inside the lungs and relatively low pressure outside the lungs, and air rushes out to the outside environment. So this is what causes us to breathe out. So ventilation is this process of 1, inspiration, and 2, expiration, all driven by muscles and the weight of our rib cage, and all reliant on this inverse relationship between pressure and volume. So please watch this a number of times to understand this, this concept. It's a very important one and it's often asked on exams. Okay, so we've seen that this ventilation maintains concentration gradients of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and the alveoli and blood flowing through adjacent capillaries. So adjacent just means the capillaries which surround the alveoli. So a nice picture taken here from your textbook. You can see they're almost like little grapes. At the bottom of this bronchiole tree, this upside down tree that gets smaller and smaller, we have these little sacs, very thin, single-celled sacs. And this is actually where the gas exchange takes place, in this cluster of alveoli. And on the right-hand side there, you can see the red and the blue lines indicating capillaries, very small blood vessels running all around the alveoli. And this is where gas exchange takes place. At the end of the bronchioles are small clusters of air sacs called alveoli. These alveoli are surrounded by very small blood vessels, which is also known as a capillary bed. And this is where gas exchange takes place. This is where oxygen comes in to the blood and CO2 leaves the blood. We can see here a cross-section through the lungs, and we'll be doing a similar dissection. So you can see the larger tubes there that have been cut through, so they would represent the bronchi or the larger bronchioles. And we can see the small spaces which represent the tiny little bronchioles coming through to these air sac regions. And here is a microscopic view of the alveoli. At the top you can see the outer surface, and at the bottom you can see some of these alveoli which has been cut through. Really important to note there, very, very thin, which is great for diffusion to happen, as we'll see. This is taken from your textbook. So it shows one capillary which is shaded in pink with the blood vessels, the blood cells running through it, located right beside the circular alveoli. So deoxygenated blood enters the capillary bed, and we can see there at the very top, it comes from the right ventricle of the heart and it goes through the pulmonary artery. So we can see the blood flowing from the top through the capillary and out to the pulmonary vein again, and it's running past the alveoli here. Remember, the blood that enters is coming from the body. There's been a lot of work, so it contains high levels of CO2 and it contains low levels of oxygen, because all of the oxygen has been given over to the mitochondria and has been used for energy production. The inside of the alveoli, where the fresh air has come in, is high in oxygen and it's low in carbon dioxide. Therefore, diffusion becomes important. Oxygen moves into the capillaries from the alveoli by diffusion, from high concentration to low concentration of oxygen, as represented by the blue arrow there. And the opposite is true. The blood contains high levels of CO2, so they move from the blood to the alveoli where there's relatively low concentration, and as we breathe out, this CO2 is taken away from the body. Really important to note that both alveoli and also capillaries have single-celled walls. As you can see, very thin walls represented by those tiny little pink cells. which makes a really short distance for diffusion to happen. This really aids the level of diffusion for those gases. So what we're seeing here with the oxygen coming in and the CO2 going out, this is gas exchange. Now I'm leaving this picture here again because we need to talk about two different types of cells that are involved in the construction of the lungs or the construction of the alveoli. So you can see these also located in the drawing. First of all, type 1 pneumocytes are extremely thin alveoli cells or alveolar cells that are adapted to carrying out gas exchange. Adapted by being very thin and having a very, very large surface area. It creates a short distance for diffusion, so gas exchange can happen very quickly. Very common question on the exam is to talk about how lungs and alveoli are adapted for gas exchange. Please keep these things in mind. Another understanding is type 2 pneumocytes, which are very different. They secrete a solution containing surfactant. Now this surfactant creates a very moist surface inside the alveoli, and it basically decreases the water tension. And this prevents the sides of the alveoli sort of sticking together or adhering together, which could lead to damage and reduce the level of diffusion by reducing the surface tension of the water. So lungs do need to be moist. Remember, the gases need to diffuse through a watery or aqueous environment, but we can't have these little, very fragile little sacs sticking together. So the type 2 pneumocytes are really important here in creating that surfactant. They're not very good with, or they don't help to improve, the surface area. They're cuboidal shaped cells, so they're cube shaped cells. So they're not flat or thin like the type 1 pneumocytes. They are simply there to create this surfactant and reduce the surface tension. Really interesting that type 1 pneumocytes, so these extremely thin cells, they cannot do mitosis, which is cell division. So the really important point here is if they are damaged, for example, through smoking or inhalation of some other chemical or cancer, they cannot be replaced. Type 2 pneumocytes, on the other hand, can perform mitosis. So these cells can be replaced if they are damaged or if they are lost. So it's an important note there. And the last skill I really want to look at here, this is our required practical number 6. So this will be the 5th one that we've done. And all I want you to do is read through the box text, the blue box, which is on PDF pages 310 to 311. So just read through that, make some notes. It's a fairly basic experiment compared to some we've done, but it is a required practical. Please read through, make notes, monitoring ventilation in humans at rest and after mild and vigorous exercise. So in future, we'll be discussing this further and we'll be conducting a simple experiment in class to address this requirement. So please be prepared for that. So other than that, please be like the woman in the lower picture there and just relax, make some notes on this video, and I'll see you in class very soon. All the best for now.